What if the dominant interpretation of a major world religion was based on a fundamental centuries-old error? I mean, that's a pretty provocative question, right? But it's right at the heart of a new interpretive framework called BioIslam. It directly challenges what it calls traditional Islam, and it argues that a tragic misstep in history requires a complete rethinking of the faith. In this explainer, we're going to break down this really complex and, frankly, controversial argument.
So, to really get our heads around this, we'll first explore what the source calls a crisis of interpretation. Then, we'll zero in on its most powerful piece of evidence, the historical error of slavery. After seeing how this difficult past is confronted, we'll dive into the proposed solution, BioIslam, and we'll finish up by looking at the really unique philosophical lens it uses to understand our place in history.
All right, so at the very heart of this source is this really profound conflict. It pits the dominant historical interpretation of Islam against a brand new framework, arguing that the old way has led to some deep moral and societal problems. So on the one hand, we've got what the source calls traditional Islam. It defines this as the interpretation that was really constructed back in the 8th and 9th century CE, which it holds responsible for some major historical errors. And on the other hand, you have the proposed solution, BioIslam, a modern framework that's designed to be more ethically resilient. The central claim, really, is that if a method like BioIslam had been adopted early on, the history of the Muslim world might look totally different. The whole foundation of this critique rests on what the source calls tragic errors. And these aren't just, minor slip-ups. They're defined as these colossal, centuries-long blunders by the scholarly class, the ulama, that reveal a deep flaw in their methodology. Now, the main example is the permission of Rick slavery, but the source also points to other major errors, like forbidding the printing press for 250 years, or presenting the prophet in a way that it argues is just inconsistent with the Quran. And to show you just how high the intellectual stakes are here, the source brings in the influential 20th century scholar Abul Allah Maududi. He was actually criticizing modern Muslims for apologizing for slavery, calling it a kind of mental slavery to the West. This quote is used to show just how deeply the justification for slavery was embedded within traditionalist thought, even well into the modern era. Okay, so this brings us to the source's main case study. To really prove its point about the failure of traditional Islam, the text just zeroes in on the institution of Uric slavery, which is a term it uses for the specific form of slavery that was regulated within Islamic law. Now, to really grasp the gravity of this, the source puts a number on it. Citing contemporary academic research, it states that over 14 centuries, tens of millions of people were brought into Muslim lands as slaves. The text even references one analysis that ranks the Middle East slave trade as the third worst atrocity in human history, based on proportional population. This isn't just some dry statistic. It's presented as proof of a massive, systemic moral failure. This timeline, this is really crucial to the source's argument. Now, it does note that the first state in the world to abolish slavery was actually the small Muslim state of Senegambia, followed by Tunis, but it emphasizes that these had very little influence on the wider Muslim world. The central and, for the source, the deeply embarrassing point is that the heartlands of Islam were some of the last places on earth to formally abolish slave ownership, with Saudi Arabia doing so a full century after the United States. So this leads to the huge question the source is asking. Why? Why did an institution so at odds with the Quranic ethos of mercy and justice stick around for so long? And maybe more pointedly, where were the voices of the ulama, the religious scholars condemning it? Well, the text basically argues that far from being silent, the historical ulama were complicit. It claims there's no record of widespread scholarly protest against slavery for centuries. And it gets worse. When reformers like Syed Ahmed Khan called for its repudiation in the 1870s, they were met with fierce opposition. The powerful Meccan ulama actually went so far as to issue a fatwa, a formal religious edict, branding Khan a heretic, basically casting him out of the faith. And their defense, according to the text, was pretty rigid. You cannot forbid what God permitted and the Prophet himself practiced. And this just goes to show you that the critique goes way beyond slavery. The source lists 6 other inconvenient implications of this traditional framework. And these are not minor issues. You've got deep theological problems like abrogation, where later divine verses are said to cancel out earlier ones, creating what look like contradictions. They also touch on social issues like the permissibility of wife-beating and even fundamental uncertainty over core rituals. For the source, these are not isolated problems, but symptoms of a single flawed interpretive system.
So to make sure this argument isn't just, an opinion piece, the source really grounds its argument in some serious contemporary research. It does this through an extensive analysis of the work of Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown, a really prominent scholar of Islam, focusing specifically on his book, Slavery and Islam. The source praises Brown's work for its brutal honesty and for not shying away from these deeply troubling historical reports that are found right within the traditional canon. This detail about the Prophet's grandson, Hassan, is presented as a prime example. For the source, this isn't just some shocking historical tidbit, it's evidence of a dramatic rollback of the moral horizon that happened in the generations right after the Prophet. And to push back against what it sees as this kind of apologetic argument that Islamic slavery was exclusively humane, the source pulls examples like this one. While it acknowledges that elite or domestic slaves might have been treated well, it highlights the brutal conditions faced by those in agriculture or mining. This quote is used to argue that the suffering of the majority of slaves, the non-elites, was just immense and that it can't be whitewashed. So the source then kind of distills what it calls book's nuggets from Brown's research, these key findings that it believes seriously undermine the integrity of the traditional narrative. This includes a hadith that seems to question the finality of prophethood, disturbing accounts of the behavior of revered figures, and evidence showing slave ownership was widespread all the way across society. It also highlights the ulama's alleged don't ask, don't tell policy regarding the illegal enslavement of people, which allowed the markets to flourish. So the big takeaway here is that the source is using this modern, heavily footnoted scholarship to back up its central thesis, that the traditional canon contains deeply problematic material that led to a tragic moral error. All right, so after laying out this really extensive case for failure, the source pivots. It moves from the problem to the solution. And this brings us to the constructive part of the argument, the proposed alternative framework of BioIslam. So what is BioIslam? Well, the text defines it as scientific Islam, and the goal isn't just to reform or renew, but to reconstruct. It's presented as a whole new operating system for the faith, one designed to be compatible with modern ethics and scientific understanding, and specifically engineered to prevent the kind of tragic errors it claims happened in the past. And the methodology is actually a pretty clear four-step process. It starts with the 5 inside pillars, which, and this is crucial, includes empathy as a core principle. Then, it uses a latent principle approach, which basically means it looks past the literal historical context of a verse to find the timeless ethical principle behind it. The stated outcome is a version of Islam that is not only consistent with modern ethics, but is also structurally incapable of repeating past mistakes. And this, of course, brings us right back to the central test case, slavery. The source makes this really bold and frankly controversial claim that the Prophet Muhammad did in fact abolish slavery in his vicinity, and that its reemergence was a moral rollback. It argues that if a framework like BioIslam, with its focus on empathy and underlying principles, had been in place, this rollback would have been impossible. The abolition would have been permanent. Okay, for the last part, the source zooms way out from its specific critique to offer this broader, philosophical vision of history, a vision that explains why a new framework is so urgently needed today. The source leaves us with this final, really profound question. I mean, if the scholarly class could be so wrong for so long on something as huge as slavery, if the canonized interpretations are fallible, then where does that leave believers today, in an age without direct prophetic guidance? And the answer, according to this text, is this concept of al-fatra. This is a term for an interprophetic period, an era between prophets. The source argues that we are living in such a time right now, after the Prophet Muhammad and before the prophesied return of Jesus. It's characterized as a time without the clarifying presence of a prophet, an age where moral confusion can set in and the moral horizon can be compromised, which it believes explains the historical, tragic errors. This all leads to a really unique way of looking at history. It rejects the simple golden age and decline narrative, and it rejects a purely cyclical one, too. Instead, BioIslam proposes what it calls a convex view. So picture humanity's moral progress like a long upward climb, but with these deep valleys in between. Each prophet creates a new peak, raising the moral horizon. After they're gone, there's a long period of backsliding into a valley, but the next peak starts from a higher base. It's a fundamentally optimistic vision of history, seeing us not in a decline, but in a long valley before a final redemptive ascent. And so our look at this source material ends with this final provocative question. Citing the Jewish philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel's line that history is a nightmare, the source asks us to consider our own perspective. Is the story of humanity simply one of inevitable corruption and decline? Or, as the framework of BioIslam suggests, are the tragedies of the past merely a long, difficult prelude to an ultimate final redemption? It's a really profound thought to end on, leaving us to contemplate not just the interpretation of Scripture, but the very meaning of history itself.